rise to the occasion during some of our darkest hours. As Premier, I couldn't be prouder of what we've accomplished by working together during such a difficult year. And I'm looking forward to rolling up our sleeves and working together to lay the groundwork for a swift recovery when the time is right. Until then, I want all our municipal leaders in rural Ontario to know we will always have your backs. This is a government that fights for rural Ontario. Over the summer, I had the chance to visit many of your communities to see how people were doing. I saw firsthand so many great examples of the Ontario spirit from the entrepreneurs and businesses I met. And I saw and heard firsthand the challenges you face. Throughout this pandemic, we've been there to support you. I sat at the table with the Prime Minister and my fellow premiers, and I fought for our municipalities. We secured a $19 billion deal with Ottawa, $7 billion for Ontario, with $4 billion for municipalities. That's $4 billion to support critical municipal services, including shelters and transit. And just last month, we allocated further funding from this deal to help our municipal partners go into 2021 on stable footing. That was $695 million to ensure municipalities didn't carry deficits into this year. We want to help you get back on your feet because we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel grow brighter as more vaccines arrive every day. I am pleased to report that Phase 1 of our vaccine rollout plan is well underway. We've administered well over 200,000 vaccines to date. We now have the capacity to administer 20,000 vaccines a day, and we're working to double that by February. And General Hillier and Dr. Tan and the task force have already started the vaccine rollout to rural, northern, and indigenous communities. But in the meantime, we're actively laying the groundwork for a strong economic recovery. As part of our 2020 budget, we're investing $142 billion over the next 10 years in strategic infrastructure projects, including many projects in rural Ontario. And today, I'm thrilled to announce, right here at Roma, we're investing $200 million again this year in the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, or OCIF. We recognize that municipalities need flexibility to support their own priority infrastructure needs. This funding will help 424 small, rural, and northern communities across Ontario, with critical projects like building and repairing local roads and bridges, as well as water and wastewater infrastructure. These are projects that create local jobs, support local businesses and suppliers, and improve the overall quality of life for people living in the communities. All of these things are critical to a strong recovery for communities in rural Ontario. As Premier, I've always made it a personal mission to ensure that the people of rural Ontario have access to better broadband and cellular services. As COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, having high-speed internet and reliable cell service is absolutely critical for our daily lives. Ontarians rely on it for everything from online banking to learning or working from home, or even just watching a movie with your family. In a post-pandemic world, we also see the opportunities that remote work and more online access can bring to rural communities and businesses. But to get there, we need to start investing today in that infrastructure. And that's exactly what we're doing. Last fall, our government committed an additional $680 million by 2026 as part of our broadband and cellular action plan. This brings our total investment to nearly $1 billion to ensure that more communities across the province are connected. We're already supporting shovel-ready broadband projects in southwestern and eastern Ontario. We've invested $71 million to improve broadband connectivity in Eastern Ontario, and another $63.7 million towards the Southwestern Integrated Fiber Technology, or SWIFT project. We also recently announced $10.9 million to improve broadband services in northern communities. This funding will help advance 6 broadband projects in several northern towns and First Nation communities. As we continue to wrestle with the public health trends, I want to say again, tough times don't last, but tough people do. And we have the toughest people anywhere in the world right here in Ontario. I'm truly grateful for the ongoing
misagonagenin ekosichigean. Bebe kangein tagois, gain enemigois, gainin mavi so casual. Misagonae. Igwech.
Miigwech, Elder Howard Copenis. I would like to take this time to introduce Premier Doug Ford.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Brent, for the introduction. And I want to thank you, Brent, for the 30 years of service with Indigenous education. Thank you to Minister Rickford, Elder Howard Copenis, Grand Chief Kavanaugh, Chief Mark Hill, Teresa Stenlund, Councillor Region 1 of the Metis Nation of Ontario, for joining me today. Like all Ontarians, I was heartbroken by the tragic news that a burial site had been found at a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. We grieve for each of the 215 children that lost their lives, as well for their families and the communities that they were taken from. This is a moment to recognize the painful legacy of Canada's residential school system and of the damaging, lasting effect it has had on survivors and Indigenous communities. We know the news from Kamloops has deeply impacted survivors and their families, and that Indigenous people are hurting. including here in Ontario. We're here to support them. Indigenous leaders and Ontarians are seeking meaningful reconciliation. And while we're prepared to work with the federal government, we simply cannot wait any longer to act. To support survivors, their families, and Indigenous communities. That is why Ontario is committing $10 million over the next 3 years to identify, investigate, protect, and commemorate residential school burial sites and cemeteries. Our government will work in collaboration with Indigenous leaders to ensure the process is Indigenous-led and respects the wishes residential school survivors and their families and the affected communities. And we will see this work through right to completion. We will also ensure appropriate mental health supports are available. There is painful but necessary work ahead, and we must confront what happened for reconciliation to be achieved. It's important for all Ontarians to be aware of the dark history and painful legacy of the Indian residential school system, so that we can work together to build a more equitable Ontario for Indigenous people. Now, I'll hand things over to Minister Megwich.
Well, thank you, Premier, and I want to thank you for your leadership and your confidence to proceed with this important announcement today. I also want to thank my cabinet and caucus colleagues as we rallied over the past couple of weeks to respond to one of the most horrific events as part of Canada's darkest chapter in its history. I want to thank Elder Howard Kopanis for getting us started today in a good way. And I appreciated the opportunity earlier this morning to speak to the Chiefs of Ontario and let them know what we're announcing this morning. Brent, thank you. Brent Toucanet is hosting us here with his amazing team at Seven Generations. We have a COVID-appropriate announcement here, but he's got an amazing tech team. And this institution really is the face, the complexion of a modern Indigenous education. And Brent, you've led that charge for a long time, and we appreciate it in detail. We know there's likely more to this story. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done important work to bring the truth to light, but we have more work to do. And in searching for these sites, we know that these are reopening wounds, some that have never healed, frankly, and bring painful memories to the surface. That's why it's critical that any search and recovery Indigenous leaders and Indigenous organizations, as well as Metis. And we will ensure that ongoing culturally appropriate mental health supports are available. Technical expertise, our capacities in forensics and pathology and mental health support are leveraged, but those of independent providers, many of which are already working with some long-lasting impacts of Indian residential school. And so it is today, not just with a deeply professional but personal commitment to the leaders who are here today and speaking, but to the Indigenous people of Treaty 3 and lands all across this province to move forward. Indigenous communities have waited. Indigenous people of Ontario. Initial site identification will be the first step in what is anticipated to be a much more extensive process. And we're committed to seeing this work through to completion in collaboration with our Indigenous partners. While some communities might wish to undertake this work immediately, there will be some that may not be able to do so. The wishes of affected families and Indigenous communities will be respected, and approaches will be flexible and community-driven. We will work with all of you to address this matter. Over the next few years, we will work together to identify, protect, and maintain Indian residential school cemeteries and unmarked burial sites. When we can, we will appropriately commemorate these sites and the lives lost and repatriate the remains of children for families to bring closure and move forward, should that be the wish of affected families and communities. And we will explore ways to work together to increase public awareness and deepen our collective understanding of the histories and the harms of the Indian residential school system. Through a principled and collaborative approach, we will begin to uncover the truth, to rectify past wrongs, and meaningfully contribute to the sometimes difficult work of true and full reconciliation. I'm thankful to the Indigenous leadership who join us here today, and I look forward to hearing from them in a moment. I want to thank Grand Chief Kavanaugh, Grand Council Treaty 3, Teresa Strenlin of Metis Nation here in Kenora, Chief Mark Hill of Six Nations of the Grand River, who's joining us virtually today, and other Indigenous leaders here and that I joined earlier this morning to share in this news. I also want to mention and appreciate the letter that I received from MPP Saul Mamakwa in Keewatin. Saul, I know we spoke in the legislature not long ago. The contents of your letter, I think you'll find, are respected and reflected in the work that was well underway the moment we found out of the horrific tragedy in Kamloops. I look forward to working with you on this. I also want to acknowledge the words of support from other chiefs, Ontario Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald, who called for this process, former Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation, and my friend Alvin Fiddler. I'm honored to have your support in this plan. We will continue to rely on your knowledge and experience as we move forward. I want to thank everybody for being here today and making this announcement so special. My name is Greg Rickford. I'm the Member of Provincial Parliament for the Great Kenora Rainy River and the Treaty 3 lands. It's a privilege and an honor to serve my constituents, and it is humbly that I accept the responsibility to work with Indigenous peoples to recover, remediate, and move forward on this difficult chapter in the history of the Indigenous peoples here in Ontario. Thank you, Miigwech, Niawan. I'll now turn it over to Grand Chief Francis Kavanaugh. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Miigwech, I'd like to thank our Honorable Minister, Greg Rickford, for introducing myself, also inviting me to take part in today's announcement. So kami ganang digo, kebe asige nenege gimas kinak, ke squatte gabo, ke oe nimiteo izoin. Josh. Slightly. Okay, I just lost my train of thought. Anyways, I'm glad to be here. You know, I'd like to also acknowledge and say Miigwech to our elder, Howard Kupanes from Notikumewaning. You know, I appreciate his words during his invocation and song to commemorate the lost souls, the 215th, and the subsequent remains that have been found in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan. And I'm sure there will be lots more found. Anyways, I have a prepared statement. Good morning, everyone. Miigwech for being here today. After the news of the 215 children found in Kamloops, our nation is heartbroken. This news has affected our people in deeply profound ways. While we already knew this occurred in Canada, it is incredibly painful to relive, especially for survivors and our families who have bravely been telling us the truth for decades. But truth be told, it has impacted every First Nation member throughout this land we call Canada. I have spoken to several people over the past few weeks of the unmarked graves on residential school properties here in Treaty 3. I have also heard of a desire to search for our children, to bring all of our children home. Survivors have told us firsthand of children being buried in secret off school grounds or even cremated. We can work to locate these buried on school grounds and the surrounding areas. I have had early discussions with elders and knowledge keepers as to how best we can conduct this effort. It is important that our efforts are done in a proper way to respect the spirits of the children. I will continue to have ongoing discussions with the nation to make sure no further harm occurs to the survivors, our families, our people, and our communities. Many Canadians were shocked, perhaps shamed, with the news, and I encourage them to learn about the real history of residential schools and of many other forms of colonial violence inflicted upon our people, starting with the territory they reside in, which is the nation of Treaty 3. I acknowledge the Government of Ontario for taking steps beside us in our search to face the realities of residential school. This requires people to admit uncomfortable truths, and the burial of children in unmarked graves is a Christ is a Christ crime against humanity, and I would deem the perpetrators of these atrocities less human than us. As a society, we can no longer hide behind the past or deny the realities of what happened in Canada. We must admit the crimes of the past and actively work towards ensuring that this no longer buried truth. The survivors, our children, our families, I want to offer my support, and that you want to, if you are ready to, please reach out to someone to talk to. We cannot suffer in silence any longer, and it is important that we work through this together. Jimmy Wedge for this day. Also, I just want to share a little bit of personal, how I'm personally impacted by this. I myself did not attend residential school, but I had four of my sisters and one brother older than me that attended. And it pains me to have to relive their experiences. I once watched one of my sisters talk to a federal negotiator during a lunch break. She talked about her residential school experience with this non-native federal negotiator. And I don't know what they were saying. I was never brave enough to ask either, but both of them were sobbing, and it pains me to think about that today, and that's why I say that not only survivors are impacted, it's all of First Nations people in Canada are impacted by this discovery. With that, miigwech again to the government for making this happen today. Miigwech.
Miigwech, we'll get you to Kavanaugh for those words. Powerful. I'd like to introduce Regional Councillor for the Northwestern Ontario Metis Community, Teresa Stenland.
I just wanted to begin by acknowledging we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe of Treaty 3 and the Métis Nation. I also wanted to acknowledge and thank Elder Howard Kopanis for the opening prayer and song, Chinigwich. I also want to acknowledge Premier Doug Ford, the Honorable Greg Rickford, Agichata Francis Kavanaugh, Chief Mark Hill, and all those community leaders, guests, and others who are present here today or that may be watching this announcement. Today, I am thinking of the 215 Indigenous children that tragically lost their lives, and the hundreds more that lost their lives in the 130 residential schools across Canada. Sadly, so many in the Métis Nation have close family members who attended residential and day school institutions. My own family has been impacted by residential schools, but they were able to make it back home. Métis, First Nations, and Inuit children, families, and communities suffered under Canada's residential school system. However, the Métis experience of residential schooling remains largely untold. The schools tried to undo and eliminate what made us who we are: our languages, our cultures, our beliefs, and the very family and community structures that made our communities what we were or are. Our presence here today shows they failed in their ultimate goal. Still, many of our community members were forever hurt and changed, and some never came back to us. Premier Ford, Minister Rickford, your announcement today of an initial investment of $10 million over 3 years and a commitment of immediate funding, which will be guided and led by Indigenous decision-making, is another step along the reconciliation and Ontario's commitment to establish strong, collaborative, and mutually respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples in Ontario. It acknowledges the huge negative impact these schools had and continue to have within our communities, and it charts a course of action to begin to address them. Thank you for your commitment to the Indigenous peoples of Ontario. Minister Rickford, I'd like to present these moccasins to you on behalf of the citizens of the Northwestern Ontario Métis community as a gesture of appreciation for walking towards reconciliation. So, miigwech. Merci, Marcy, miigwech. Thank you.
Miigwech, Teresa, for your words. I'd like to take this time to introduce Chief Mark Hill of Six Nations of the Grand River. He'll be accompanied by his Indian residential school survivors. Chief Hill.
Scano, Sego, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I would first like to start by acknowledging and thanking some of our survivors of the Mohawk Institute who are with us here today. I'd also like to recognize and acknowledge the opening prayer and song as we go and discuss further such a difficult topic. Also joining us here today and want to recognize Mayor Kevin Davis of the City of Brantford and MPP Will Bama for Brantford Frank. I want to take a moment to bring a historical reality to life. Imagine your home life with your children. You raise them in your family, in your community, in your language, and with your culture and tradition and values. In the day-to-day life of family, your children learn what it means to be who they are, and they learn their identity and where they come from. But one day, officials representing the government show up at your front door and take your children away from you. They're put in a faraway institution, like example, what we're standing in front of today, where there is much misery, neglect, and abuse. You will not see them for a very long time, if ever again. Some of your children die, and some you don't even know what happened. Their bodies are not brought back to you, but instead, they are buried in unmarked graves, and you never again know what happened. This was the experience of all too many Indigenous families, and all of our communities remember. After the 215 children were found at the Kamloops Residential School, a full investigation into all such burial sites across Canada has become critical. At Six Nations, this has been a bitter renewal of grief for all of us. We too had our children taken away to a residential school, the Mohawk Institute, also known as the Mush Hole, again, which we are standing in front of today. This was one of the oldest, longest running of the residential schools, operating for 142 years. The intent was the same, to change us, to make us other than who we are. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has documented evidence of 52 children who died here, but we don't know how many others are out there, or most importantly, where they are buried. We know that there were 46 children from Northern First Nations communities sent here, but again, we don't know what happened to them. The Mohawk Institute was unregulated and unaccountable from the start. As the TRC said, the federal government was responsible for neglecting the health and safety of children. This failure to establish and enforce adequate standards, coupled with the failure to adequately fund the schools, resulted in unnecessarily high death rates at residential schools. But this failure of the federal government was built on an earlier crime: the forcible removal of our children from their parents, families, and communities. To this very day, at Six Nations, there are whispers within our community about our missing children and where they might have been buried. It is past time that we find them and bring justice. Six Nations is adamant that we must do this right, and with the best technical expertise and equipment available. I am so pleased that the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has made today's announcement and is willing to lead the country in taking the right steps, because it is critical that we work together. When it comes to the mush hole, the word complex does not begin to capture the essence, scope, and magnitude of the investigation required to search for the missing bodies of all children buried on the grounds of the Mohawk Institute. The Mohawk Institute burned down twice, changed locations, and was associated with substantial farmlands of well over 350 acres at least, on which the children were made to endure hard labor. In recent decades, nearby developments have also encroached upon related properties, which raises additional concerns about the feasibility of locating certain possible burial sites of our children who went missing so long ago. We must work with other First Nations communities in this process, as many of them also sent their children here. We don't know how many children in total we're talking about, and again, it is essential that we find out. The TRC also said that there were 51 children missing, but 215 bodies were found. The question is, how many will be found here? After reading a recent CBC article, I am disturbed and angered that it seems some companies may even be looking to take advantage of First Nations communities in the search for missing children. We must not allow those offering false services for their own profit to take advantage of survivors or our community. Make no mistake, Six Nations is adamant that there is no other option but to do this right, with the best credible technology and experts. And again, they must be led by Indigenous communities and survivors. That is why we must approach this from a death investigative process. And we have called on the Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police, the Solicitor General, the Attorney General, and the Chief Coroner's Office. And further, why we have sought the support of the Premier of Ontario and the Government of Ontario. Precedent has been set. Bodies have been found on the IRS property, and now by law, all other properties must be searched. Deaths have been reported, and there are reasonable grounds for these investigations, as there is no other option. With the Government of Ontario committing to a full investigation of burial sites, Six Nations is encouraged in the hope that we will find all of our missing children and bring to light what exactly happened to each of them. In closing, we express our solidarity with everyone affected by the recent discovery or haunted by the intergenerational wounds, and we will continue pressing forward to protect all children of today and provide a better future for the coming faces of tomorrow. I commend again Premier Ford, Minister Rickford, and all of our partners. And finally, I would like to again say nyawat to all of our survivors for being with us here today. We honor you, and your courage has brought us all together. We cannot skip justice and just go straight to commemoration. Commemoration is important, but that is not why we are here today. We are here to seek truth in the pursuit of justice and that every child matters. Thank you, and Yahweh.
Miigwech Chief Mark Hill for your words. I'd like to take a moment here to say miigwech to Premier Doug Ford, Minister Greg Rickford, to the Gitchada Francis Kavanagh, to Teresa Stenland, to Chief Mark Hill once again, the Treaty 3 Chiefs, Chief Lorraine Copen is sitting behind us. Before we end here, I'd like to just, in honor of the survivors, and to take a moment just of silence here to think about our lost children in Kamloops and the others across Canada. Miigwech. I'd like to introduce Elder Howard Copenes for a closing prayer.
Miigwech. Our teachings, our elders say, when we come together to talk about life, to talk about our children, to talk about our journey ahead, we do not close our gatherings. We just say miigwech until we meet again. And it's one of the teachings that has been with us for many, many generations. So at this time, I would just like to share with you a miigwech song that will help us to remember today and also go forward in a good way. How miigwech song.
Miigwech Howard for the song. That concludes our announcement today, and media and question and answers start now.
A reminder, if you have a question, to please use the raise hand function. And our first question comes from Randy Raff with CHCH TV.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for taking my question. I'm wondering, the Catholic Church isn't represented here today. Is there any place for them in this? And do any of the native or the indigenous spokespersons have any message for them?
I'm not sure who you're addressing that question to, but I'll take a crack at it. I was a signatory to the Indian Residential School on behalf of thousands of survivors across Northern Ontario. At that time, the Catholic Church was involved in bringing elements to the agreement, but I think other political leaders, and I won't speak for Indigenous leaders, some of them are here today and I think would want to make comment on that, but I absolutely think they should become an integral part of this process to the extent of their involvement.
Which, Greg, I guess from our perspective as First Nations people, I believe that the Catholic Church needs to come forward and make efforts to bring the Pope to Canada for a formal apology to all First Nations across Canada. I believe it's incumbent on them to do that. You know, like I said before, for me, it's very painful to be up here talking about what happened to our people. You know, there's going to be more remains found. I'm certain of that. And the perpetrators, even I've been reading different accounts from people that are still alive and in pain, being re-traumatized and stuff like that. They still see their perpetrators who are still alive and still they haven't been accountable. They haven't been made accountable for what they've done, you know, in creating some call cultural genocide, but for us, it's genocide. That's what took place. They wanted to wipe us out. That's why I say those people that did these atrocities, you know, they were very dehumanizing. That's why I say, you know, to me, the perpetrators were less of a human being than us. That's what I believe in. I mean, why would another human being do what they did to our children, to our people? They need to be held accountable. They need to come forward and try bring the Pope to come about and make that official apology to the people of First Nations of Canada. With that, Dr. Miigwech, for allowing me to say a few words. Ahaw Miigwech.
Randy, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. I'm wondering if the if criminal charge, clearly horrific crimes took place in these schools. Do we anticipate any criminal charges to come out of any of these investigations?
Well, look, through the following from the Indian Residential School Agreement, obviously there were a number of processes that addressed issues of abuse and other kinds of activities. What we've announced here today is focusing on providing support to an Indigenous-led decision-making process to gather information to support forensic and pathological information to bring closure and a new beginning to the Indigenous peoples of Ontario, survivors, their families, and their communities. As Chief Hill, who spoke so eloquently today, and I had discussed a couple of days ago in helping to put pieces of this together, it would be available for the communities to understand and assess the information as it comes to light. But the province's role, obviously, in a federally administered program in partnership with other entities, our interest and our role and responsibility in this today, as has been said by a number of Indigenous leaders, is to simply support them, to leverage our technology and our capacity. I'm sorry, I had my mask on there. In an effort to identify, investigate, protect, and commemorate this horrific occurrence from the Indian Residential School legacy. Thank you.
Your next question comes from Laura Stone with the Globe and Mail.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Minister Rickford. I wanted to ask you about the timelines. This is a 3-year plan, but there's no firm timeline on when the work will actually start or finish. It also speaks to the need to follow the community's wishes. So I'm wondering if you have any more specifics on when you think this work will start, and how confident are you that you'll be able to achieve consensus to get it done?
Well, immediate and confident. We've worked closely under the leadership of Premier Ford with Indigenous leadership, the Chiefs of Ontario. We've worked through some challenging issues and turned them into opportunities. I don't see any reason to believe that we won't be able to do anything different in this situation. Phase 1 and Phase 2 provides for immediate funding. It focuses on trauma-informed, culturally relevant, and responsive mental health and wellness supports. In addition, to consolidate the work that Ontario has been doing in response to the Truth and Reconciliation report in these regards specifically, and it's not limited to recommendations 71 through 77 in the digitization, archival records, and gathering various other information, which I believe will be foundational to the work that Indigenous-led groups will endeavor to start immediately. That's why we've mobilized a significant resource at the front end of this. And frankly, Laura, we've left this opportunity down the road to understand what the most appropriate commemorative activities would look and feel like. So these resources are committed and intended to be immediate, to respond to the work that's going on across the country and even here in Ontario, and especially as Chief Hill and their community par excellence is leading a process there in the identification, investigation, and ultimately the protection and commemorating as information becomes available their findings.
Laura, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. My follow-up is for Premier Ford. You mentioned in your remarks you didn't want to wait for the federal government to move on this. What exactly did you mean by that? Were they asking the province to wait for more consultations? Do you think it's taken too long? Can you just expand on why Ontario has decided to move ahead right now?
You know, Laura, this is federal jurisdiction, but I'm not going to wait to support our Indigenous community. We've built an incredible relationship with all Indigenous leaders across the province. And I've always said from day one, we're going to have their back. And I'll never break that promise. I'll always have their back. I'll always support them. But the atrocities, the tragedy that's happened in the past, we have to investigate it. We have to support the investigation led through the Indigenous community. And we're going to make sure we go to the full extent and make sure that they have the support that they need. I just don't have time to wait for the federal government. We should be acting on it immediately, and so should the federal government be acting on it immediately. But we have a great relationship. I'm very, very thankful and grateful. We've built this relationship through Minister Rickford, that's done an incredible job, through chiefs right across the province, and through Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald. We have an incredible relationship with Chief Mark Hill, so many And we're going to continue that bond and move forward and make sure this is part of reconciliation.
Laura, if I could just add, we have become concerned about the resources allocated by the federal government and the pressures that will be on it. We take responsibility for the relationship that we have with the Indigenous peoples of Ontario to support them in these efforts, and the pressures on that program led us to commit new resources, additional resources for this important work. After this announcement, I'll be writing my provincial counterparts, and hopefully we'll be able to join in a meeting and start to put the contours to a framework that other provinces can perhaps use and learn from, because we believe what we're announcing here today is leadership on this matter. Indigenous leaders have spoken, and we'd like to move forward with them and our provincial counterparts in making sure that this work is done respecting the desires of the Indigenous peoples across Canada, and that will happen very quickly.
Your next question comes from Holly Mackenzie Sutter with the Canadian Press. Holly, if you could just unmute your mic.
Hi, question for Minister Rickford. I wanted to ask you how you arrived at the figure of 10 million for this process, and if there could be more allocated if that's required as the work progresses.
Well, thank you. You know, this is never an exact science, but in our in building out the work and understanding the kinds of activities, realizing that there is internal capacity within the provincial government. I mentioned the coroner's office and our capacity in pathology. The experts out there that are already doing work, we believe that this was a reasonable amount of resource, and we vetted that, socialized it, if you will, with other Indigenous leaders, and we committed to make much of this at the front end focused on trauma, health and wellness supports, and the immediate physical activities associated and technology requirements to support this. It can be available as we move forward to understand if additional resources are required, but we will call on the federal government at every turn to ensure that their partnership in the province of Ontario is as focused as what we've rolled out here today, and we'll make an ongoing assessment of our resource commitment as required. In addition to that, I've had an opportunity to speak with my friend and colleague, work closely with her, Minister MacLeod, on some of the commemorative elements of this, which will be down the road once we understand the scope and extent of what this work has found. As difficult as that is to imagine, I thank Minister MacLeod for her leadership and desire to work with my ministry where other resources may be committed as part of Ontario's heritage. Thank you.
Follow-up?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the search might extend beyond sites that are designated as Indian residential school grounds, like if there are other possible burial grounds that aren't a part of those official sites, could the work extend there?
The answer is yes. Much of this information is within the knowledge of survivors and Indigenous leaders. And today what we're providing is an opportunity moving forward for that information to come forward. As you heard Ogichida, Grand Chief Kavanaugh allude to, it may be true that there are unmarked graves and that they may not be immediately proximal to the known 18 Indigenous or Indian residential schools, as they were called at the time. And that's what this work is intended to focus on, as much as the known burial sites that some communities have done some well-established work on. Thank you, Holly.
Your final questions come from James Murray at Net News Ledger. James, if you could just unmute your mic.
Hi, James.
Good morning. Good morning, Minister Rickford. Good morning, Premier Ford. My first question is to Premier Ford. The speed at which you've acted on this is great. This is an important issue. It's good to see Ontario taking leadership. There's two other areas where Ontario may need to be taking leadership. The first one is in the community of Kashechewan, where the number of people with COVID is skyrocketing. And is Ontario prepared to step in and do some more work in Kashechewan?
Absolutely. Dr. Tian has done a great job in vaccination or remote immunity. We moved quickly on that as well. And I want to thank the people from Orange and the leaders throughout First Nations communities when we flew in there. I understand that we have the second doses for the most part done. We're going to be flying in as well to make sure we support getting the 12 to 17-year-olds and anyone else who needs to be vaccinated in case they miss the vaccination. But that was so well organized through leadership throughout the Indigenous communities that we flew into and Orange, and they did an incredible job. So we're going to be up there. We're going to support them any way we can, and we'll make sure that happens immediately. Matter of fact, I think they'll be going very shortly.
Follow-up?
My second question is to both the Minister and to the Premier. And again, it ties to the speed at which you've acted on the residential schools. Can we see similar speed happen for solving some of the land claim issues that are going on in Treaty 3, in Nikakusa-Minikani, in Kukuchiching, and in the other communities? That would help families for reconciliation as well. And it seems to be taking an awful long time.
Well, I'm happy to answer that, James. In fact, maybe to the contrary, respectfully, my friend, what Indigenous leaders have been talking about since we took government was the quick settlement of some outstanding land claims and flooding claims. Many of those have been stalled over the past decade since coming to government. We've moved quickly. We recognize that there are others that have complexities to them, some involved in court proceedings. But we've made a commitment, and it's been clear, and we've delivered to Indigenous communities across this province in an unprecedented way the resolution of many land claims, some of them very large scale. The Williams Treaty comes to mind, something that I had worked on in my previous chapter as a federal member of parliament for Kenora and working with Indigenous affairs federally and my regional responsibilities as a minister here in Northern Ontario. We're committed, and we will continue to work on these processes expeditiously, and as you said, bring closure and reconciliation with respect to land-based claims moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rich.
Thanks, Premier. Good to see you.